The woman in your life will do what she must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can rest so easily. She knows everything you do because the woman in your life is you. The woman in your
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Women's Spaces. My name is Elaine Holtz, and I'm your host. And as always, I'm extremely excited because today I have as my guest the wonderful songwriter, singer, teacher, and activist Holly Neer. But before we start, I just want to remind everybody that this is Women's History Month. Actually, it's Women's International History Month. And I hope you're doing something to celebrate it. Either go to a women's function or just call up a woman friend and say, wow, we've come a long way. Anyway, without further ado, I would like to introduce my guest, Holly Neer. Holly, welcome to Women's Spaces.
Thank you. Thanks for having this show and keeping it alive and making sure that we have this dialogue in the world going on all the time.
Oh, thank you so much for that. You know, the way I try to start the program out is this program is dedicated to ordinary women doing extraordinary things. And oftentimes people confuse ordinary. They think, oh, ordinary is just, oh, I'm just an ordinary person. Well, you know, in reality, we're all ordinary women, and we're all doing extraordinary things just by being women. So what I'd like you to do is just give my listeners a little background, anything you like. You know, you can start from the day you were born or you can start today. It doesn't matter. Whatever you feel comfortable talking about.
I've been doing workshops and master classes around the country called Demystifying Activism. And so when you brought up this idea of ordinary people, it's very exciting to me because I feel as if we get this idea that someone has to do something like Cindy Sheehan or like Julia Butterfly, something that seems almost impossible to ordinary people, that they would sit in a tree or be able to do that kind of activism. And the only reason those women were able to do those things is that people who are not doing those things are creating the space for them to do that. And I don't just mean by being their assistant. I mean by changing the world enough that something like the work that Cindy Sheehan is doing to stop the war could even happen. Because if we are not part of a global women's peace movement, then an act like that can't even be seen. And so no matter what we're doing, let's say, I remember a woman I met one time who was working in a shelter to help women who were abused, and it was a full-time job. She was there all the time, and she'd started it. And she was frustrated because during that period of time was when the anti-apartheid movement was going on in South Africa, and she wanted to be part of that. It was very exciting what was happening there. And she said to me, but I'm just too tired. I don't have time to go to any more meetings. And I said, well, we can't all be everywhere all the time, but we can bring everywhere and all the time to us. So if you make sure that there isn't racism in your shelter, you are doing anti-apartheid work. So I try to help people in this workshop realize that you don't have to break all of our issues down into causes, but see it as one full body of activism. So even if you're walking down the street and you look at teenagers in the eye and say, hello, how was school today? That's a kind of activism because we are so ignoring our teenagers nowadays that just that act of kindness, I've done that a couple times and they've looked at me like, whoa, you know, nobody said hello to us in a long time. So I think little tiny acts all accumulate and become the global activism of peace.
You know, it's interesting you say that because at the end of the program I always say if every woman just did a little tiny bit for peace, just think what the world would be like. Well, let's just go back just a little bit. How did you in your own life end up becoming such a strong activist?
Well, I grew up in a progressive family, but I don't think that's necessary. I know lots of people who came from conservative families that ended up moving over and becoming peace activists. I had intended to become a Broadway singer and go to Broadway. I worked in film and television for several years, and I did go to New York and did hair on Broadway. But while I was doing hair, the students at Kent State were
Yes.
protesting the invasion of Cambodia, and some of them were shot down by the National Guard. And I remember people coming to work that night and some of the actors saying, it's against union rules, but we want to propose a protest tonight to stop before the finale and say to the audience what has happened, and that we want to have a moment of silence to think of the students at Kent State. And I abstained. I was only like 19 years old, and I didn't know where Kent State was. I didn't know what the invasion of Cambodia meant. And I said, whatever, but I can't vote because I don't really know the issues. And we did do a moment of silence that night, and it kind of set me on a path of wanting to find out more what was going on. Even though I had been anti-war, I hadn't sort of transferred it to my everyday life. I did a little bit of protesting in high school to stop the recruiters from coming on campus. We're having that struggle again. Here we are, 40-some years later. But then I went to UCLA, and I remember a philosophy professor who had a silent vigil every week, and I was afraid to stand with him. I felt kind of shy about it, but finally I did. So little tiny things of trying things. It just grows on you. You start with one thing, and pretty soon you do another.
You know, you brought back a memory to me. You know, I don't talk about myself too much on the program, but because of this little memory that you brought back, I'd like to share it with you. I was kind of in the same camp that you were. You know, I was anti-war. I knew war was not the correct thing to do, but I was also at the time, I was a journalism major, and this was in 1970. And I was coming into my class, and my editor said, why don't you go out? There's the wheelchair brigade is here, and I want you to do a story on them. Nobody's here to do the story. I said, the wheelchair brigade? I mean, what is that? You know, and all of a sudden I go out, there's 50 Vietnam veterans in wheelchairs holding up signs protesting the Vietnam War, and I was stunned. And as I interviewed them, and you know, it's interesting, we're having the whole thing with Walter Reed Hospital, and here we are in 1970. In fact, I have an old Time magazine, Life magazine, that's dated May 22nd, 1970, where they showed the conditions of the Veterans Hospital across the United States at that time. But anyway, what really radicalized me and put me on the front line was when I talked to those vets and realized, number one, that they were injured in an unjust war, and secondly, that they were not getting the care that they needed. And that turned me into an activist. But it seems like it takes one little thing, and suddenly you're out there. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and you never know where it's going to come from. So here is a Vietnam vet who gave you the gift of consciousness. And I've had Vietnam vets come up and talk to me, and when I was first organizing with vets in 1971, we went to the Philippines and Okinawa and Japan and Hawaii, and we're working with soldiers who were opposing war and racism from within the military. And they gave me a gift of consciousness, but they've also come up to me years later and said that I gave them the gift of consciousness around feminism, because they heard me sing a song on that tour, which was a Beverly Grant song, I Can't Be Yours and Still Be Me. And the vets, the soldiers cheered for that song because they were hearing it as I can't belong to this military industrial complex and still be my true heart. I can't go and kill for you. That's the door in which they heard the song, even though Beverly Grant had written it as a feminist song. And then they came back later and said they slowly started to understand that what I was saying is that just like they felt like they couldn't be owned by the government, that women don't want to be owned by men. So we give each other the gift all the time.
Well, that's a good way to look at it, because we are giving each other a gift. And as I'm sitting here listening to you, I'm thinking, my goodness, we're talking about 1970, and here we are in 2007, and I feel on some levels women are trying to move forward, but at the same time have taken a few steps backwards with some of the commercialism that's going on today. And here we are in another war that's based on certain levels of dishonesty and incorrect information, just like Vietnam. What do you think, you know, in your travels, because you've been many, many places, what do you think is preventing us? I mean, I know this is a big topic, but what do you think is preventing the human race from living in peace and finding ways to negotiate and to talk with one another?
Well, I think we have to remember when we're growing up into this work that we're not headed towards nirvana necessarily. This is what life is about. It is people who share different belief systems coming together and trying to spend what little time we have on this extraordinary planet to do some good. It doesn't mean that there's ever an end to it. It's a process. So two things in response to what you're saying. One is that I think we're doing way better than we think we are because we don't have access to the corporate media. If you woke up every morning and turned on the television and saw the good things that people are doing rather than all the murder and the theft and the destruction, and you saw actually people successfully supporting humanity, we would feel differently about our work. I mean, 80% now are opposed to the war, opposed to the Bush administration, think that he lied, think that there's possibly something legally inappropriate that's happened. We never had that kind of support during the anti-war movement when we were trying to stop the war in Vietnam. We are so much farther ahead. Women are farther ahead. The anti-war movement is farther ahead. We just don't know it. And so part of what I think is that if we would show ourselves, in fact, my most recent CD was called Show Up, if we would show ourselves on a regular basis and not be afraid to talk about peace. People are afraid to talk about peace in what's supposed to be a democracy. So we have to get our muscles together. We have to go out and make a commitment that we'll talk about it at least once a day, if not once an hour, to our neighbors and our friends and our children. And one of the best ways is to talk about peace and to talk about women's issues or talk about racism. Any of those things isn't to lecture other people, but to ask them, for example, to say to someone who's pro-war, all right, tell me, go ahead, convince me, if I have a child who's 19 years old, why should I send my child over to Iraq and possibly have them lose their life, lose their soul, lose their heart? Tell me why I should do that. Talk me into it, because if you really believe in it, you ought to be able to tell me why. People have a very hard time when you put the question to them like that. They can't think of a reason.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned something like that. I wrote this poem called I Am Women, I Am All Women. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to transcend race and culture and just look at women, children, mothers, children. And when you bring that up about would you want to send your 19-year-old, I've taken it even a step further. Why would you, what is it that allows you to allow your son and daughter to go kill another mother's son or daughter?
Mm-hmm.
And also in war, most of the victims are women and children. Right. So, I mean, it's a question that as women, as the birthers, whether we have children or not, this is our divine whatever, maybe need to ask that question. What are we allowing our children to actually do?
It's horrific what we're asking them to do. It's unconscionable. But it's very easy to try to make this more detached. And so I think when we have these conversations with our neighbors, first of all, we don't have to talk anybody into being against the war if they're extremists, way out there on the right wing somewhere. We only have to get everybody who already thinks the war is wrong to say so. And when you put it like that, it's not as demanding a job as if you had to talk someone who is very pro-war, pro-gun, pro-flag, any of those kind of things, into feeling like it would be appropriate to bring our troops home. We only have to convince those people who already agree with us to step out into visibility. And when that happens, then our Congress is going to be more effective because they want to get reelected. And if they see that we are the majority and we won't reelect anybody who votes for war, we won't. I have on my website a slideshow of pictures from Iran. And if you go to my website, which is hollynear.com, go into the art and activism section, and then scroll down, is this who we want to bomb? Is this who we want to drop bombs on? And it opens it up in these beautiful pictures of Iran that none of us have ever seen. We don't have any idea of what it looks like. How many people actually knew what Baghdad looked like before we destroyed it? If it was as beautiful as Paris, it was as beautiful as San Francisco. We have to personalize these things. And one of the things that women have done always in our politics, and I shouldn't use the word generically, I mean feminist women, peace-loving women, because there's a lot of women out there who haven't done this. We're not all one, unfortunately. But one of the things we've done is to personalize the political. and to say you can't just have a rhetorical conversation with me about this. You can't just say, oh, there's lots of hungry people. You have to say there's one hungry person, there's another hungry person, there's another, and they have names and they have families, and we're not just going to throw them into statistics. And that's something women are really good at, is personalizing it. And I suggested, I think the people, I said earlier how the peace movement, I think, is in better shape, and I think that actually women are in better shape. The area that I think we're having the most trouble in right now, that we have to take very seriously as women, is that I think we're not doing so well around race and around poverty. Those two issues, I think, we're actually backsliding in a very big way.
Well, I think one of the most important things, that's very important that you mention that, and I think that the way that we can overcome that is if we start identifying as women, woman to woman, and then the old saying, there but poor fortune go you or I, because I think it's not, I'm beginning to believe that on some levels we have forgotten what it is to be compassionate for one another, or to take care of one another, or to identify with one another. I mean, that's what, in the Vietnam War, what got many, many women out was that young girl running with the napalm, because there was your child, God forbid, and you couldn't escape it. It was right in front of you. Well, I'm going to flash something on the screen now, because one of the things that I find very interesting about you and your work is that you tend to pull together your art and your activism. And the symbol of this is so interesting to me, with the stop war, and there's the mother with the child. Do you want to go into that just a little bit?
Well, one thing that I love about that picture is it wasn't digitally created. It's an actual photograph. We were actually at a rally, and there was a woman holding this child, and I was listening to the speaker on stage, and the photographer caught that image. And I think that as you had said earlier, that women and children are incredibly affected by war. And I know sometimes when people hear us talk like this, the first thing that they think is, well, what about the men? And I want to say that as a woman who has lived with men who have embraced feminism and who have taken on and felt like they really learned a lot about women from feminism and about their own selves, that when we identify as groups, it's really important to start seeing it not as an exclusion of others, but a celebration of an identity. So, for example, when people of color get together and they want to have an event and they invite people of color to come, and they sort of suggest they'd rather not have non-people of color, well, I mean, I guess we're a color, but people from Northern European descent not come, I honor that and celebrate it. I don't feel excluded. I don't feel angry about it, because I really feel like there's a joyful time for people to come together at different times. So I just wanted to say that, because there's an old throwback, I think, to the 60s, where people felt like if you had a black movement, or if you had a women's movement, or if you had a deaf movement, that those were movements of separatism. And they really are, in my mind, a way that people find something that can hook them together. Now, other people maybe will hook up around baseball, and other people will hook up around science. And some people want to hook up around gender, and other people want to hook up around race. People hook up around something, and it's not so much as an exclusion as it is finding some commonality.
Well, when you're talking about that, I remember when the women's movement started happening, and there was a lot of stuff around, oh, are we going to exclude men? If you were part of the women's movement, they automatically assumed you were a lesbian, and all these different values were attached to that, when in reality what was happening is suddenly you felt pride. You were a woman. You had strength. You were bringing something to the table. You weren't just somebody's property. I mean, it made a big difference. I mean, young women today don't recognize or realize what it was like not to have some of the rights that we have today. I mean, and that's why we have to fight so hard to hold on to them. And when you're talking about cultures, when cultures band together, again, the whole black movement, like black is beautiful. I mean, suddenly, James Brown coming out, I'm black and I'm proud. There's a certain pride that takes place. But then the next step to me seems that now we have to start integrating based on, we have our own sense of pride. Now, how can we come together as a larger population and work towards peace?
Well, you're assuming that everybody came through the door at the same time.
Oh.
And we don't. We all come through doors at different times. And not all young people don't understand what their parents and grandparents went through. There's a lot of young people who totally get it. In fact, they get it more than I got it around my parents. I think that we have to stop making generalizations, and I don't mean to be critical of what you just said, except that I think we have to watch our language so that we don't say all young people are all this or all that, because we aren't the same. And there are some people who are just now coming together with their own sense of self, and they are feeling that kind of very personalized pride. And they need to have an opportunity to go through that phase. And there's other people who have been through that, who are now at a place where they say, okay, I have enough political experience, which gives me a certain amount of maturity that I didn't have when I was 19 or 20. And so that puts me in a different stage in my life. You know, you have children and you have teenagers and you have young people and you have middle age. You know, we have these different stages of life we go through. So I'm at a stage now where I actually have enough political experience where I want to start looking at the hard stuff of bringing the different movements together. I think that I want to do that. And there's, interestingly enough, the strongest allies that I have for that are the young ones who came in, some of whom came into a world where they didn't know those separations used to exist. So we can't really identify necessarily all by age, or we come to this differently. And I think it's important to remember that, because everybody's got to have their own experience as it comes to them, and it's not cut and dried.
Well, you're talking about, you know, another level of compassion, you know, once again, to understand that everybody's on their journey. Mm-hmm. And as long, to me, I mean, maybe this is judgmental. To me, it's, the journey needs to be for peace and love, or peace and acceptance of one another.
Yes, but if you come into your life in a family where you've never seen peace and love, where all you saw was screaming and hate and beating and abandonment and abuse, you can't just say to that person, peace and love.
Oh, no,
you know,
no.
there's a process that that person is going to have to go through, and they're going to have to be held dear. And fortunately, there are some organizations and some people out there that will help invite them into that process. But we can't assume that everybody walks into the room all ready to work for peace and love. And that's why I think it's really important to combine, when you're doing global peace work, to make sure that there's a very strong component that's dealing with children. Because if we don't give children the opportunity in those first 7 years to have some sense of self, some sense of self-worth and identity, it's much harder for them later on to find that. It's if a child is beaten every day for 7 years, it's really hard to get them back.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right when you say that. You know, sometimes we tend to maybe get a little idealistic, you know, because we want something so bad. You know, we just want peace. You know, we want, you know, stop warring already. You know,
And you didn't come to it when you were 4. You came to it later in your life in different ways. You slowly grokked your way into who you are, and so did I. And that's the life process. And part of being a global peace movement, I think, is to create opportunities for people to change, but not be frustrated at the rate of speed in which they do. So that's why I like being an artist, is that I can do a concert, and those concerts are invitations to people to come investigate some part of yourself. I'm not going to tell you what to believe, but I'm going to sing all these different songs and tell these stories, and somewhere in there, hopefully you'll find some piece of yourself that you identify with, and hopefully you'll also hear something that is very mysterious that you've never heard anything about before, and also hopefully you'll hear something that scares you. Because when we are alerted by fear, we have to make some decisions about whether we're going to move forward or not. I have this idea that long time ago, when there was some tribe out in the desert and they saw an eclipse and they didn't know what it was, that there were some people that ran under the trees and gathered together and huddled in fear, and there were other people that stayed out under there and went, wow. Now I want to hang out with the wow folks, but I also want to figure out how to create a very open and loving invitation to the people who are shaking with fear.
Well, I'll tell you, in my opinion, you're just an example of that. I mean, the idea that your openness and the way you perceive things are so powerful to me, and always have been. You know, one of the things that you instilled in me is that you told me that as a woman I could stand up. I could have a voice. I could write poetry. You know, I could do different things. I mean, here were these women during your time with all these women coming out with the music and all the wonders. You know, we can go on and on about our history here, but time is starting to run out. But you have been, definitely have been an inspiration for women like me, and it's true. Exactly what you said. I have not always been this open or this aware of things. It's a process that we have to go through, and we need to remind ourselves over and over that not everybody's on the same page, to be a little bit patient, but still to keep calling to the women to gather and to do something, even if it's just a tiny bit, even if it's like you said, talking to a neighbor or saying hello to a teenager.
Or inviting them to something. I mean, somebody invited me to my first this or my first that. I didn't always walk in by myself. I think the art of invitation has been lost. And let's say there's 50% of the country is opposed to the war. I think it's more like 80. But if everybody who was in that 50% invited one person off the fence, I mean, do the numbers. The math is phenomenal. And we just have to empower ourselves to know that we have the capacity to change things as a human species and as a community. The other thing, too, that I think is really fun is to get up in the morning and say, I'm going to do one thing that's achievable today. Instead of having these big things, well, I can't become a part of the anti-war movement because I can't, there's nothing I can do. There's always something we can do. So we have to name it. Maybe you'll write down all kinds of things and put it in a basket and stir it up and pick one out every day and do that one thing.
Well, you know, Holly, I hate to say this, but I didn't even flash your name on the screen. I can't believe it, to let people know who I'm talking to, and it's just been so exciting. But we're coming to the end of the program. And to my listeners, I want to say that this has been an absolutely wonderful experience for me. And I want to thank Holly. I'm looking at the time. And Holly, if you could just go ahead and look at the camera and just take about 50 seconds to say whatever is in your heart to our listeners.
Well, first I would invite you to take a look at my website so that you can have access to some of the links to peace groups like Code Pink and the United for Peace and Justice. And then I would ask you to look in the mirror and look at that person in the mirror, just like I'm looking at this camera, and make sure that there's something that you see there that is a contribution that you can leave behind. This is your chance to be on this planet. We're spinning through space at an unimaginable rate of speed. It is awesome, and you're important to it. So think about what little thing you want to give and empower yourself to do it. It's so nice to be on the planet at the same time as you.
Well, I couldn't have said it any more beautifully, and I want to thank you once again, Holly Neer, for being here. We could have talked for 2 hours. I just love just listening to you. And to my listeners, I want to say once again, this is Elaine Holtz with Women's Spaces, saying goodbye for now.
The woman in your life will do what she must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can rest so easily. She does everything you do because the woman in your life is you. The woman in your life knows simply what is true. She knows a simple way to touch to make you whole now. The woman in your